"Ma'am, what exactly do you think you're doing on my property?" That's the first thing I yelled the moment I stepped out of my truck and saw a paving crew 3 guys in neon vests trenching straight into the edge of my driveway. Fresh asphalt steaming, power tools screaming, and in the middle of it all stood a woman in a bright pink blazer holding an iced latte like she was supervising a highway expansion project. That was my unforgettable introduction to HOA Carenthe, self-appointed queen of a neighborhood that didn't even have an HOA. She didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't even blink. She just waved her hand at the workers and said, "Finish the connection on our side." The HOA approved this adjustment. There is no HOA. Never has been. And as I stared at the 10 feet of my driveway disappearing under her illegal asphalt, the air hit that strange calm that only comes before a storm. Karen had just crossed a line carved in stone, and she had no idea the war she'd started. Before we get deeper into this insanity, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. And don't forget to subscribe for more HOA chaos. When people ask me what my neighborhood used to be like before Karen arrived, I always say the same thing. Quiet enough to hear the wind, friendly enough that you could borrow a wrench at midnight, and simple enough that nobody cared what color your recycling bin was. It was the kind of place where folks waved without thinking, where dogs trotted across lawns with no drama, and where I could run my small landscaping business right out of my driveway without disturbing a soul. I'd bought my house 8 years before the madness began. A modest 2-bedroom, a detached garage out back, and a long gravel driveway wrapping around the side like a lazy river. To anyone else, it was just a driveway. To me, it was the backbone of my business. My truck, trailer, tools, and crew all started their day right there. And not once had anyone ever complained. The neighbors liked knowing a landscaper lived close by. I trimmed hedges during off hours, helped older folks haul branches after storms, and even mowed a few lawns for free when people fell on hard times. That driveway wasn't just a strip of land, it was part of the community. Then Karen showed up. Or, as she introduced herself, Patricia Henderson, Community Standards Liaison. Mind you, no one had appointed her to anything. But the moment she moved in, her energy filled the entire block like a fog of overpriced perfume. The day the Hendersons arrived, they rolled in with matching SUVs, spotless, shiny, the kind that never touched a gravel road until that moment. The movers barely finished unloading furniture before Karen marched across the lawn to introduce herself. I remember she looked me up and down like she was evaluating a suspicious package. She didn't shake hands, she didn't smile, she didn't even blink. Just said, "You must be the one with the work truck." Like, that was a contagious disease. I told her yes, I owned a landscaping company, and she tilted her head like she'd just been diagnosed with disappointment. Makes the street look industrial. That was her first sentence to me. I didn't even know her last name yet, and she'd already decided my livelihood offended her aesthetic. Her husband, Richard, wasn't any friendlier. He walked around measuring angles of the curb, scowling at tree shapes, and muttering to himself about upgrades he needed to do to raise neighborhood standards. What standards exactly? Nobody knew. There was no HOA. We were just regular people with regular houses living regular lives, but the Hendersons didn't believe in regular. Before I knew it, they were taking over the block. In the first week, they repainted the entire exterior of their house a blinding shade of luxury cream, installed motion lights so bright they'd cook a chicken at midnight, and sent out printed neighbor suggestions, slipped under every door anonymous, but we all knew who wrote them. The notes complained about dogs barking, trash bins being visible from the street, one neighbor's wind chimes being intrusively whimsical, and most importantly, my truck. My truck was apparently the end of civilization. Still, I let it go. Everyone else did too. We figured they'd settle in eventually, maybe calm down after the renovation high wore off. But Karen wasn't settling. She was escalating. The real trouble started with cones. I came home one afternoon and found 2 bright orange traffic cones sitting on my gravel driveway, not near the property line directly on my land. I dragged them back into their yard, thinking maybe a contractor misplaced them. The next day, they were back. Repositioned, angled, almost claimed. So, I knocked on their door. Richard answered with the fakest smile I've ever seen. "Oh, those cones," he said, waving dismissively. "We're thinking the driveway between our houses could be shared. I stared at him, trying to process how someone could confidently suggest sharing land that wasn't theirs. "It's my driveway," I told him plainly. "Yes, but you have plenty of it," he said, smiling like he'd solved a math problem. "We entertain often, and we simply need additional parking. It just makes sense." "No," I said. The smile dropped so fast you could hear it hit the floor. "Fine," he snapped. "We'll see about that." And oh, we did. Over the next week, little things started happening. Chalk lines drawn across my gravel, like someone was planning construction, small flags stuck in the soil that weren't mine, and Karen strutting around with a clipboard as if she were surveying land for a major highway. One morning, I found a paper taped to my door titled "Driveway Violation." Again, there is no HOA, yet the paper had HOA printed in big, bold letters. I knocked on their door again, harder this time. "Karen," I said, holding up the fake citation, "this neighborhood doesn't have an HOA." She barely looked at me. "Oh, we've been discussing forming one. It's long overdue." "We?" Who was we? Because every other neighbor I talked to had the same reaction. A groan, an eye roll, and a prayer to any deity available. I was irritated, but still confident. After all, I had paperwork, deeds, maps, surveys. What could she possibly do? Turns out a lot. See, Karen wasn't just entitled. She was delusional enough to think boundaries didn't apply to her. She acted like the universe gave her authority the moment she bought a house. She talked about rules she made up. She left nasty notes on people's cars. She complained about the width of sidewalks. She tried to ban one neighbor's teenage son from skateboarding because it threatened the tranquility of the block. And the strangest part? She delivered all of this nonsense with a soft, polite tone, like she genuinely believed her tyranny was a community service. Then the renovations started. Not their house, but apparently mine. I was loading equipment into my truck early one morning when she walked up with her iced matcha, sunglasses perched in her hair, and that always condescending smile. "You should consider updating your driveway," she said casually. "It's very rustic." "Rustic works for my business," I replied. "Well," she said lightly, "some of us prefer a more refined aesthetic." I shrugged and kept working, refusing to take the bait, but her tone sharpened as she added, "Besides, if we're going to share it, it really should meet HOA standards." "We're not sharing anything," I said. Karen's smile disappeared. "You're being unreasonable." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth had already been said, but in Karen's world, no wasn't a boundary, it was a challenge. That afternoon, she marched around her property with a tape measure like she was preparing for battle. I saw her pointing toward my driveway, drawing something on a clipboard, muttering calculations under her breath. For any normal person, this would have been a warning sign. But Karen didn't operate on normal logic. She operated on delusion, mixed with entitlement, sprinkled with HOA fairy dust. It wasn't until the following week, the week everything imploded, that I realized she had been planning something far bigger than cones and chalk. Up until that point, I had thought Karen was merely annoying, power-hungry, or bored. I didn't yet understand the full truth. She wasn't just playing HOA, she was trying to become the HOA, and she was about to prove it in the most aggressive, outrageous way imaginable by stealing 10 feet of my driveway while I was at work. But that's a story for the next part. I should have known something was seriously wrong the moment I saw Karen pacing up and down her driveway with that tape measure again, dragging it behind her like she was marking a crime scene. I'd seen her do plenty of bizarre things since moving in, but this time, she looked like a general preparing for an invasion. You could practically hear the dramatic music swelling behind her as she kept yanking the tape, snapping it back, pointing toward my driveway, and scribbling frantically on her clipboard. At first, I told myself she was just being herself, a one-woman HOA cosplay who liked pretending she owned the block. But the way she kept staring at my driveway, narrowing her eyes like it had personally insulted her, that was new. And worse, Richard was out there with her, nodding approvingly like she was presenting a multi-million-dollar business plan. I watched them from my porch as I sipped my coffee. The sun had barely risen, but Karen was already in full command mode, barking out instructions to her husband about imaginary property lines. They were both wearing brand new matching jogger sets, as if they dressed specifically to commit a property crime. I swear, it looked like the kind of outfit rich villains wear in movies before they bulldoze a community center. At one point, Karen caught me watching. Instead of stopping, she gave me a smug little wave, the kind of wave you give someone right before you ruin their life. I didn't wave back. Later that day, I saw the cones return to my driveway. Except this time, instead of 2 cones, there were 4 perfectly lined up, color-coordinated with Karen's hideous pastel garden gnomes. I dragged them back onto her lawn, again and again, and every time she would drag them back, planting them deeper into the gravel like she was claiming territory for a future nation called Karenland. Oh, by the 3rd time, I knocked on her door. She opened it with that same tight-lipped smile. "Can I help you?" "You can stop putting your cones on my property," I said. "They're there for safety," she replied calmly, like she was explaining gravity to a toddler. "Safety from what?" I asked. "Improper use of driveways," she said, folding her arms. I stared. "My driveway. Our shared access zone," she corrected. I wanted to laugh, genuinely laugh, but she wasn't joking. Her face was hard as stone, her eyes locked with mine, as if she were daring me to contradict her version of reality. So, I held up my cup of coffee, toasted her sarcastically, and walked home. But the next morning, everything escalated. I woke to the sound of a diesel engine rumbling outside. At first, I thought it was one of my landscaping trucks returning early, but when I stepped onto my porch, my stomach dropped. A full construction crew was parked at the end of the driveway, big equipment, asphalt mixers, the whole setup. And in the middle of it stood Karen, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, ponytail swaying like she was hosting a home renovation show no one asked for. She saw me and shouted something to the workers. I couldn't hear exactly what she said, but it must have been the HOA version of "go, go, go," because suddenly, men started unloading tools and marking the ground. I stormed down the steps. "What the hell do you think you're doing now?" Karen didn't even hide her satisfaction. "We're connecting the driveways," she said cheerfully, as if she were discussing the weather. "The HOA approved this adjustment. There is no HOA," I repeated, enunciating every word like I was talking to a malfunctioning robot. She shrugged. "Well, the community agrees." "What community?" She smiled sweetly. "Richard and I swear my brain short-circuited." She'd created a 2-person HOA in her head and decided that was all the authority she needed to alter my land. I told the workers to stop immediately. One of them hesitated, but Karen marched right up to him and said, "Ignore him. This section belongs to us. I have the documents." Then she turned to me, her voice dripping with condescension. "You can call the city if you want. I'm sure they'd love to hear your thoughts." For a split second, I wondered if I should call the police immediately. But the crew was already rolling out asphalt, and my brain couldn't process the level of delusion happening in real time. It felt like I'd stepped into a parallel universe, one in which a suburban woman could simply claim land with the power of confidence and an iced latte. I watched helplessly as they laid down a fresh 10-foot strip of asphalt across the edge of my driveway, smooth, black, perfectly blended into hers. It looked like one single connected driveway now, a driveway I hadn't authorized, asked for, or ever agreed to share. By the time I gathered myself enough to object again, the work was nearly done. Richard stepped outside holding a mug of coffee that said, "Boss Man," smirking like he had just conquered a small country. "Looks great, doesn't it?" he called out. "Really improves the flow of traffic." My blood boiled. "You just paved over my property." "No," he corrected smugly. "We improved our property." Karen nodded, sipping her latte. "You're welcome." I went home, grabbed my deed, my plot map, and the original survey, and marched back. Karen was now overseeing the installation of little landscape lights along the edge of the new asphalt, humming to herself. "Here," I said, thrusting the documents toward her, "you're on my property. This is all mine." She didn't take the papers. She didn't look at them. She didn't even blink. "My survey says otherwise," she said calmly. "What survey?" I demanded. She smiled like a villain revealing a twist. "Richard measured it yesterday." I blinked. Slowly. "You mean he used a tape measure? It was very official," she insisted. "This is legal documentation," I said, waving my papers. "That is a tape measure." Karen crossed her arms. "I trust his measurements." I walked away before I said something that would land me in jail. That night, I spent hours reviewing every legal document I had, calling my cousin who's a paralegal, and double-checking property maps. Everything confirmed the same thing. The Hendersons had trespassed, vandalized my property, built on my land, and acted like they were entitled to it. The next morning, Karen was already out there, admiring her handiwork. She had even added decorative stones and tiny solar pathway lights along the stolen strip, as if decorating the crime scene made it legal. Later that week, she started parking her SUV right on the stolen section every day just to remind me that she had claimed it. She even had the audacity to complain when my landscaping trailer blocked her view. She left a note on my door one afternoon that read, "Please move your truck. It obstructs the aesthetic appeal of the shared driveway." I crumpled it and tossed it into the trash. But that note, her arrogance, and their blatant trespassing did something inside me. It pushed a button I didn't know I had. Because at that point, it wasn't just about the driveway anymore. It was about respect, about boundaries, about one deeply confused woman who thought she could do whatever she wanted because her clipboard said so. And in that moment, something clicked in my brain, the same click you hear before a mousetrap snaps shut. If Karen wanted to play games on my property, I would show her how the game was really played. And the first move? Oh, it was going to be legendary. The morning everything truly spiraled out of control started off unsettlingly quiet. Too quiet. Normally I'd hear birds, the hum of far-off lawnmowers, maybe a distant leaf blower from one of my guys starting early. But that morning, the silence felt staged, manufactured. Like the world was holding its breath for something terrible. I walked outside with my coffee and froze. My driveway, the one I'd used peacefully for 8 years, wasn't just paved over now. It was being accessorized, embellished, decorated like the grand entrance of a mansion in Beverly Hills. Karen stood there with a roll of pastel ribbon, tying little bows onto cheap metal garden stakes she jammed into the edge of my stolen asphalt. Her SUV was parked diagonally, half on my property, half on hers, like she owned a runway and was positioning the lights for her private jet. As soon as she noticed me, she raised her sunglasses dramatically like she was revealing her eyes for maximum intimidation. "Oh, good," she said, smiling. "You're up. I wanted your opinion on the color scheme." "Karen," I said slowly, "why are you decorating my driveway?" Her smile tightened. Our driveway. Shared access, remember? I didn't even dignify that with an answer. Instead, I walked toward the fence line, or what used to be the fence line before she expanded her empire. The new decorative fence she'd installed without permission ran a good 8 feet into my land. It wasn't some flimsy temporary thing either. This was a full wooden privacy fence with fancy latticework and stain that probably cost more than her SUV's tires. I gripped the top of one post and shook it. Solid, cemented deep. This wasn't an accident, wasn't a misunderstanding. This was theft. Actual, premeditated property theft, committed with the confidence of a dictator claiming a new province. I stormed up to her. "You dug holes on my land. You put up a fence on my land. You paved over my land. What part of this is illegal? Are you pretending not to understand?" Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Richard did the measurements," she said, as if that explained everything. "He's very meticulous. He used a tape measure from Home Depot," I snapped. "A professional tape measure," she corrected sharply. "Contractor grade." I blinked hard. "That's not how property boundaries work." She stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was delivering a chilling plot twist in a true crime documentary. "Boundaries," she said, "are up for discussion when the HOA says so. There is no HOA." "Oh, there will be," she replied with chilling certainty. I stared at her. She stared back. It felt like a showdown in a Western, except instead of guns, we were armed with paperwork and pure rage. Richard then emerged from the side of the house, holding a level and wearing a smug grin that made me want to report him to the universe for being insufferable. "Everything's looking great, honey," he told Karen. "This really improves the curb appeal. Your curb," I corrected, "does not include my land." Richard laughed. Actually laughed. "Well," he said, gesturing broadly, "it does now." Something inside me cracked. I went inside, grabbed every official document I owned, the warranty deed, the recorded plat map, the county survey, even printouts of the online GIS parcel viewer, and came back outside with my armful of evidence, like I was presenting the opening arguments in a high-stakes courtroom drama. "Read," I said, dropping the stack onto the hood of Karen's SUV. Karen didn't look. Richard didn't look. They didn't even lean forward. Instead, She lifted her phone and snapped a photo of the papers, like she was cataloging clutter for removal. Illegal documents, she murmured, as if speaking to herself. Not HOA compliant. I nearly choked. HOA compliant? You are not an HOA. We do not have an HOA. This is not HOA land. Richard stepped forward. Actually, Patricia and I are forming a preliminary HOA council. My jaw dropped. Preliminary what? We're establishing guidelines, Karen said proudly. The neighborhood needs structure, order, unity. This neighborhood has existed for decades without needing a dictator, I said. Karen's expression hardened. I am not a dictator. I'm a leader. I couldn't help it. I laughed loudly, bitterly, and she hated it. Her face stiffened, lips pursed so tightly they practically vanished. You'll be receiving formal notices soon, she said. It's all already in progress. No, I replied, stepping forward. What you will be receiving is a lawsuit. Her face remained still, but her nostrils flared ever so slightly. I told you, she said quietly. That section is ours. I remembered something my cousin the paralegal told me the night before. Document everything. Let them dig their own grave. So I pulled out my phone and started filming. Karen immediately raised her hand to block her face, which was funny because she wasn't the one being accused of doing anything legal. Stop filming me, she snapped. Why? I asked. I'm standing on my property. She stepped closer, eyes blazing. This is harassment. No, I said calmly. This is documentation. She stomped away, muttering loudly about calling the police, the county, the city, Jesus Christ, or whoever else she thought would validate her imaginary HOA. But she didn't call anyone that day. No. Because she didn't need reinforcements. She thought the land was already hers. That afternoon, she convinced a local landscaping crew, probably by waving cash at them, to come back and add more finishing touches to her driveway connection. The workers reluctantly installed more stones, more mulch, more lights, even a stupid little wooden sign that said, "Welcome to the Henderson driveway entrance." When I confronted the crew, the foreman shrugged helplessly. Lady says she owns it. She's paying. I told him she didn't own it. He frowned, looked between the asphalt and the documents I held, and said, I don't want to be involved. No one wanted to be involved. Even the mailman walked faster when passing our houses now, like he feared getting caught in the crossfire. That night, things took an even stranger turn. Around 9 p.m., through my window, I saw Karen kneeling dramatically at the edge of the property line with a giant spotlight, taking photos of the fence from multiple angles. Richard stood behind her, holding a binder labeled HOA documentation, like he was guarding the scrolls of destiny. I stepped outside. Are you two seriously photographing a fence you illegally built? Karen gasped theatrically, clutching her phone to her chest. Don't sneak up on people. You're in my driveway, I said. She rolled her eyes. Shared. Access. I was done arguing. Words were useless. The line had been crossed so many times it might as well have been paved over, which, ironically, it literally had been. And as I stood there watching them pose like deranged real estate influencers, something inside me shifted. The anger sharpened, focused, transformed into something cold and strategic. I wasn't the one unhinged. I wasn't the one building on someone else's land. I wasn't the one inventing fake rules. I was the one who actually had the law on my side. And if Karen wanted a war, I was now more than ready to give her one, because I had just decided exactly how I would start my counterattack, one she would never, ever forget. If you've ever dealt with someone who thinks they can control your life simply because they want to, then you already understand the stage Karen had reached. She was no longer just annoying. She was no longer just a neighbor with entitlement issues. She had graduated into a full-blown suburban tyrant who genuinely believed the cosmos had put her on Earth to manage my property like it was an unpaid internship. I realized how deep into delusion she'd sunk the day she began enjoying the stolen part of my driveway. I mean, really enjoying it the way a cat lounges on a warm laptop, simply because it's yours and therefore must be conquered. On Tuesday morning, I walked outside and found her SUV parked sideways across the freshly paved asphalt. Not just parked displayed, positioned at a dramatic angle, tires shining from a new polish, with Karen standing beside it, posing for a picture that Richard was taking. She even had one hand on her hip, like she was modeling luxury sedans for a catalog I never wanted to see. I stood there staring, coffee halfway to my mouth. She waved at me like I had been invited. "Perfect angle for guests," she said brightly. "We'll be hosting on weekends, so it's good to visualize." I didn't answer. I didn't trust myself to. At lunch that same day, I caught her dragging a potted topiary tree onto the far end of the stolen driveway. It was some kind of pretentious corkscrew-shaped shrub that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. She placed it down, stepped back, squinted, then moved it 2 inches to the left, then 3 to the right, then back again. Eventually she nodded like she'd just solved global warming. A few hours later, she returned with a set of solar pathway lights in rose gold colors, the kind of lights you'd expect to find outside a wedding venue, not in a suburban driveway that wasn't hers. She lined them up along the exact border between our properties, even hammering one into the gravel of my original driveway. I walked toward her. "Karen, remove the lights from my property." She didn't look up. "They're not on your property. They are literally on my gravel." She pointed at her clipboard. "According to the adjusted HOA map, that section is under shared landscaping jurisdiction." I wanted to scream, actually scream, instead. I took a deep breath and said, "There is no HOA jurisdiction. There will be," she said under her breath, and kept hammering. But the final straw wasn't the parking, or the lights, or the cones, or even the fence. It was the Thursday night dinner party. I had just gotten home from a long job, sweaty, hungry, and ready to collapse on the couch. But instead of peace, I walked into a panorama of madness. Cars lined the street. Music blasted from the Henderson backyard. People I'd never seen before were carrying wine bottles and charcuterie boards from their trunks, and every single person was parking on my driveway. My driveway, the one Karen didn't own, the one she'd illegally paved into, the one her fake HOA now treated like a public lot. I couldn't believe it. There were 3 sedans, a minivan, and a sport coupe all occupying the stolen section. One guest even backed up halfway onto the gravel portion that was unmistakably mine, parking so badly that I could see one tire sitting on the grass. Karen spotted me. Her face lit up. "Oh good, you're home," she chirped. My sister and her husband needed a spot close to the door. I stared at her. "They're parked in my driveway." She blinked. "Shared driveway?" "It's not shared." She smiled sweetly like she was talking to a confused toddler. "Well, it is now." I didn't reply. I didn't trust myself not to commit a felony. Instead, I walked around the house to cool off. But as I did, I overheard her telling her guests, "He's been very difficult about the transition, but we're being patient. Change can be hard for some people." The way she said some people made it clear she thought I was a caveman discovering fire. One guest asked, "Is it really your driveway now?" "Oh, absolutely," she said confidently. "We're forming a formal HOA next month. He'll have to comply." Comply. The words simmered in the air like poison. When I came home the next day, the guests were gone, but the mess wasn't. There were tire tracks across my gravel. One of the rose gold pathway lights had been knocked over, a used napkin blew across the driveway, and Karen had left me a handwritten note taped to my front door. "Please refrain from leaving large work equipment in the driveway during visiting hours. It disrupts the aesthetic of the shared community space." I crumpled the note and threw it so hard it bounced off my trash can lid and fell onto the floor. I left it there. I didn't even care. The next morning, Karen had escalated again. I found a printed HOA violation warning pinned to my mailbox. It accused me of blocking shared access, failing to maintain community standards, and disrespecting parking regulations. I stood on my porch holding the paper, staring at it in disbelief. It was formatted like a real letter logo, reference numbers, even a fake hotline at the bottom. Except the hotline was just Karen's cell phone number. Neighbors saw me holding it and immediately rushed over. "Did she give you one too?" "She tried to find me for my garden hose." "She left me a warning for hosting a birthday party. For a 6-year-old. She slapped a citation on my recycling bin. Said it was off-theme? What does that even mean?" That's when it hit me. I wasn't the only victim. Karen wasn't targeting just me, she was targeting everyone. She just happened to be vandalizing my property the most, because I was the closest threat to her imaginary HOA empire. The neighbors started venting, whispering, asking what could be done. But no one wanted direct confrontation. Everyone had jobs, families, lives. They didn't have time for suburban warfare. But I did. And more importantly, I had something Karen didn't have. A legitimate claim. Legal documentation, evidence, reason. She had a clipboard. I had the law. And I also had something else, something even more powerful. Patience. Because I knew the perfect moment to strike wasn't while she was at her height of smug victory. It was when she least expected it. A neighbor, old Mr. Murphy, who had lived there since the 70s, pulled me aside that afternoon and whispered, "Son, you're dealing with a special kind of crazy. Be smart. Don't let her get under your skin. You'll win this eventually." People like her always trip over their own arrogance. His words stuck with me, because arrogance is predictable, and predictable behavior can be used against someone. I went home, studied my property documents again, measured the exact stolen area down to the inch, and began outlining a plan that would do two things at once: expose Karen's lies and make her regret every delusional decision she'd forced upon this neighborhood. The idea didn't hit all at once. It came slowly, a small spark at first, then a full-blown wildfire of strategic brilliance. If Karen believed she could take my property, then I would show her what someone legally owning property could really do with it. She liked to decorate stolen land? Fine, I would decorate it too, just not the way she anticipated. The gears in my mind were turning, the fury was simmering, sharpening, focusing, and the perfect plan, the one she could never predict, was forming right before my eyes. People think revenge always comes from rage, that it explodes out of you in a heat wave of impulsive, reckless decisions. But the truth is, real revenge, the good kind, the lawful kind, the kind that delivers maximum satisfaction, doesn't come from anger at all. It comes from clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives after you've been pushed past your limit, stood toe-to-toe with insanity, and realized the only way to survive is to outsmart the lunatic who thinks they own the world. I spent a full evening sitting on my back porch, staring at the stolen driveway, sipping a cold beer, and replaying Karen's behavior over and over like a detective studying a suspect's patterns. Every smug smile, every fake violation, every imaginary HOA rule she conjured into existence. And then it hit me. She wanted my driveway? She wanted to manage my land? Fine, I'd give her something to manage, something heavy, something inconvenient, something beautifully, legally disruptive. The plan formed so suddenly and perfectly in my mind that I laughed a deep, satisfied laugh I hadn't felt in months. I don't know if it was karma, divine intervention, or the ghost of a fed-up land surveyor whispering in my ear, but whatever it was, it delivered the exact idea I needed. Mulch. A mountain of mulch. The kind landscapers like me order by the ton. A huge, steaming, fragrant pile of wood chips that spreads beautifully in gardens and blocks driveways like a boulder in a canyon. The next morning at 7:15 sharp, I made the call to a supplier I'd used for years. 10 yards of mulch? The guy asked. Where do you want it dropped? I smiled into the phone. Right on the edge of my property. You'll see a freshly paved section. Put it right there. On the pavement? Oh yes, I said. Directly on it. He chuckled. All right, man, you got it. 2 hours later, I heard the glorious thunder of a diesel engine approaching. I stepped outside just in time to see the enormous yellow dump truck rolling down the street like a vehicle of judgment sent straight from the heavens. Karen was outside watering her ridiculous spiral-shaped topiary tree. When she heard the rumbling, she turned around, squinting suspiciously. The truck stopped right in front of the stolen section. The driver hopped out and waved. Where you want it? I pointed directly at the illegal asphalt Karen had so proudly stolen. Karen dropped her watering can. What is happening? She demanded, rushing forward. I smiled. Delivery! For who? She barked. For me. This is a shared driveway, she declared, throwing her hands in the air. You can't just dump things here. The driver looked confused. Sir, this is your land, right? I nodded. Correct. The driver shrugged, climbed into the truck, and with one smooth pull of a lever, released a waterfall of rich, brown mulch. It cascaded down like a wave of earthy justice, forming an enormous, glorious pile that completely blocked access to the Henderson driveway connection they'd stolen. Karen shrieked. Richard came running out in pajama pants, yelling, Stop! Stop! You can't do that! The driver finished, closed the tailgate, gave me a thumbs up, and drove off. I folded my arms, admiring the mountainous masterpiece. Beautiful, isn't it? I said. "You're blocking our driveway," Karen screeched. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm using my land. It's shared land," she insisted, her voice cracking. I tapped the gravel with my boot. "Then you can share in the responsibility of walking around it." The look on her face could have curdled milk. For the next 3 days, that mulch pile sat there like a monument to common sense, towering, immovable, and legally bulletproof. Guests had to squeeze past it. Delivery drivers got confused and called for instructions. Karen even tried shoveling it herself at one point, but she got winded after 10 minutes and stormed back inside, furious. But here's the thing about Karen. She can't let anything go. So, while the mulch sat, she started trying to escalate again. On day 2, she left a bright pink paper on my door labeled Emergency HOA Citation Obstruction of Community Passageway. I laughed so hard reading it, I nearly pulled a muscle. The fine was $150, payable in cash, placed in an envelope under their doormat. On day 3, Richard tried approaching me calmly, holding a mug of chamomile tea like he was the neighborhood mediator. "Let's be reasonable," he began. "I am," I replied. "We need that section accessible." "You still have your own driveway?" I reminded him. "It's inconvenient from that angle." "Then you should have thought about that before paving onto mine." He exhaled dramatically, as if I were the difficult one in this equation. Then he muttered, "We'll handle this the legal way." "Oh, I'm counting on it," I said with a smile. And I meant it, because day 4 was when I upped the ante. Mulch was just the beginning, the appetizer, the amuse-bouche in the 5-course feast of petty, lawful revenge. The next delivery was gravel, 10 tons of it. If mulch was inconvenient, gravel was a fortress, a massive, heavy, unmovable barrier that would take industrial equipment to remove. I ordered it early in the morning. By noon, the dump truck arrived, bigger this time, louder, carrying a load that shimmered in the sunlight like an avalanche made of stone. Karen must have sensed the incoming disaster, because she bolted out of her front door in slippers, screaming, "No, no, absolutely not, stop." The driver ignored her. He had his instructions. Legal instructions. I pointed at the asphalt, same spot as before. Karen shrieked so loudly a dog 3 houses down started barking. Within minutes, 10 tons of gravel poured out, swallowing the stolen driveway entirely. The sound was magnificent, like thunder, like victory. Like the universe sighing in relief that someone had finally dealt with the chaos of HOA Karen. She tried pleading. She tried threatening. She even dialed her phone with trembling fingers and screamed, "Get the police here, now!" And for once, I was delighted she did, because the police arrival was the cherry on top. The officer walked over, examined my property documents, walked to Karen's illegally built fence, then paced back and forth along the asphalt. Then, he sighed and looked dead at Karen. "Ma'am," he said, "this is clearly his property." Karen sputtered, But he's blocking our driveway." The officer shrugged. "Then, maybe you shouldn't have built on his." It was one of the finest sentences ever spoken to me. Karen's jaw dropped. Richard tried arguing but got nowhere. And the officer, a seasoned professional who likely dealt with dozens of Karens in his career, simply said, "This is a civil matter. He's not breaking the law. You are." The embarrassment on their faces was worth more than the driveway itself. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Because the final phase, the poetic, devastating finale, was still to come. And let me tell you, Karen had absolutely no preparation for what I was about to place on that property line. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't illegal. And it certainly wasn't subtle. But it would be unforgettable. If you think the gravel incident was enough to humble Karen, then you've never met a true HOA-bred egomaniac before. Normal people experience embarrassment and pull back. Normal people hear a police officer say, "You're in the wrong," and take a moment to reflect on their actions. Karen? Oh no. Karen absorbed that humiliation like a solar panel absorbs sunlight, storing it deep inside so she could weaponize it later. For the next 2 days, she sulked around her property like she was the tragic heroine of a soap opera. She'd stand dramatically at the edge of the gravel, hands on her hips, staring at the mountain like it was a fallen monument of her empire. Sometimes she'd poke at the rocks with a broomstick, as if nudging them would magically make them disappear. Other times, she'd storm back inside, yelling at Richard about how the community was at risk, and this is a challenge to our authority. Yes, our authority, like she was the president of the United States and not the self-appointed dictator of a non-existent HOA. On the third morning, neighbors began slowing down as they walked past, whispering, chuckling behind hands, trying very hard not to be obvious. But Karen noticed every smirk, every raised eyebrow, every amused glance, and she hated it. She wasn't angry about the stolen land being exposed. She wasn't angry about being wrong legally. No, she was angry because she'd become the butt of the neighborhood joke. That's when she cracked. Around 9 a.m., she marched outside wearing oversized sunglasses and a bright red blazer like she was going to a hostile boardroom meeting. She stomped toward the gravel pile and pointed at me as if summoning me to court. "We're done playing games," she announced. "Finally," I said. I couldn't agree more. "You will remove this obstruction immediately," she demanded. "No," I said plainly, "I won't. It is illegal to block a shared driveway," she shrieked, voice cracking. "Not illegal," I replied, "not shared." Her face turned the color of a flamingo that just found out it couldn't return something without a receipt. "This is harassment," she screamed. "I will call the county. I will call the city. I will call Ghostbusters," I suggested. She nearly vibrated with rage. Richard emerged from behind her holding a stack of papers, the same ones he'd crafted using his tape measure and the imagination of a 6-year-old playing pretend government. "Here," he said sternly, thrusting the papers toward me. "This proves the boundary line. It proves," I replied, holding back a laugh, "that you need a new hobby." Karen snatched the papers back and glared at me. "This is your last warning." I raised an eyebrow. "Or what?" She didn't answer. She just spun around dramatically, nearly tripping over her decorative spiral shrub, and stomped back inside the house. Richard followed, muttering something about escalation protocols. That was the moment I knew something was brewing. Something ridiculous. Something only Karen could conjure. But I didn't know how unhinged it would get. That night, around 8:30, I heard the sound of a power drill. That was suspicious enough on its own, but the laugh, the manic little giggle that accompanied it, sent a shiver through my spine. You know the sound a Disney villain makes right before revealing the master plan? That's the sound I heard. I walked outside with a flashlight. There they were, Karen and Richard, installing a sign on the other side of the gravel mountain. A sign that read, "HOA enforcement area, no dumping, no blocking, no parking, violators will be fined." I burst out laughing. Karen spun around. "This is official business of a made-up HOA, I replied. "It is not made up," she barked. "We have bylaws. You have a binder with stickers on it." "It's a charter," she hissed. "A community charter." I took a picture of the sign just to immortalize the absurdity. Karen shrieked, demanding I delete it. I didn't. In fact, I took 3 more photos. Her scream echoed across the neighborhood like a banshee disturbed from its crypt. The next morning, the sign was still there, crooked, improperly drilled, and already starting to lean, like it was embarrassed to be associated with her. That's when I decided it was time for the final piece of the plan. Mulch was good. Gravel was great, but this next move? This would be unforgettable, iconic, the kind of thing people would still be retelling decades later at family barbecues. I made one phone call, one simple call, and by noon the next day, the delivery truck arrived. Not a gravel truck, not mulch. A porta-potty, a bright, bold, electric blue porta-potty. The delivery guy jumped out, looked at the chaos around him, and said, "Where do you want it, man?" I pointed directly at the property line. "Right there," I said, perfectly centered on my land. Karen came running out like she'd been shot out of a cannon. "No, absolutely not. You cannot put that there," she screamed, hands flapping in pure panic. "I can," I said calmly. "You cannot place that thing on a shared driveway. It's not shared. It blocks the entry to our driveway." "I know." The delivery driver looked between us. "It's his land," he said simply, shrugging. Then he unloaded it, slamming it down with a satisfying thud, and locked it in place. Karen screamed, a high-pitched, ungodly scream that rattled the windows. "What is wrong with you?" she howled. "Property usage," I replied with a shrug. "Completely legal. You did this to mock us." "No," I said. "I did this because I needed a temporary restroom for work crews next week, and because you told me this land is shared, so I assumed you'd be happy to share the view." The look on her face was priceless. She turned to Richard. "Do something!" He looked helpless. "What?" It's a toilet. It's a porta potty, Richard. A filthy plastic box on display for the entire neighborhood. It's clean, the delivery driver added helpfully, brand new. This did not comfort her. Neighbors began gathering. Some tried not to laugh. Others didn't try at all. Even old Mrs. Turner from across the street came out just to get a better look. "Oh my," she said, chuckling. "Now that's placement." Within hours, the entire block knew. By sunset, everyone was calling it Karen's Throne. The name spread like wildfire. Kids whispered it as they biked by. Retirees muttered it while walking their dogs. Even the mailman said it under his breath when he delivered a package. Karen heard every single instance, and each time she got angrier, more flustered, more unhinged. That night, she called the police again. 2 officers arrived. They looked at the porta potty, looked at me, looked at Karen. "Ma'am," one officer said carefully, "he is within his legal rights to place this on his property." "But it's an eyesore," she shrieked. "That," the officer said, "is not illegal. It violates HOA guidelines," she insisted. "Ma'am," the officer replied, exhausted, "there is no HOA." Karen gasped, genuinely offended. "We are in the formation process. That," he said, "is not legally binding." She tried to argue more, but the officers had heard enough. They left shaking their heads. One even patted me on the shoulder as he went. That night, Karen filed a lawsuit, not against me, against the porta potty. I'm not kidding. Her complaint listed it as a deliberate act of hostility causing emotional distress. I laughed so hard reading the complaint that I nearly pulled something in my back. And so, there we were, the war fully escalated, the lines drawn, the madness undeniable. But little did Karen know, every shovel of mulch, every pebble of gravel, and every second of porta potty panic had been preparing her for the grand finale. Because the courtroom battle that was coming, that would be the end of her empire, and the glory of my victory. If you've never seen a person unravel in slow motion, let me tell you. Watching Karen after the porta potty arrived was like watching a chandelier crack one tiny crystal at a time before the whole thing shattered spectacularly onto the floor. She was a walking tension wire tight, creaking, and one step away from snapping into a full suburban meltdown. By the second day of Karen's Throne, sitting proudly on the shared boundary she'd invented, she stopped pretending she had dignity left to preserve. She began pacing outside like a prison guard on double shift, muttering to herself while shooting death glares at the blue box as if she could evaporate it with pure rage. Richard tried comforting her at first, though he did it with the defeated energy of a man who'd accepted his fate long ago. He would stand beside her, hands in pockets, nodding sympathetically while she ranted about property values, community image, and the downfall of neighborhood civilization. But even he had his limits. I could always tell when he'd had enough. He'd slowly drift backward until he was far enough away to pretend he'd never been involved. But Karen didn't need an audience to perform. One afternoon, I caught her filming the porta potty from at least 6 different angles, narrating some sort of dramatic monologue for her phone, like she was creating a documentary about crimes against humanity. "This," she said breathlessly, circling the structure, as if documenting a dangerous predator, "is what happens when neighbors abandon decency. This is blight. This is harassment. This is war." I stood on my porch sipping iced tea. "It's a toilet, Karen." She jumped. "Don't sneak up on me. I'm standing in plain sight. That's harassment." "What part?" I asked. "All of it," she shouted, storming off in a fury. Her theatrics weren't what broke her, though. It was the ridicule. Kids biking by would chant, "Karen's Throne," like it was their new favorite song. Teenagers posed in front of it for TikToks. Retirees walking their dogs chuckled openly now, instead of pretending not to laugh. Someone even left a paper crown taped to the side of it. That crown nearly ended her. Karen came tearing out of her house, screaming like a feral creature, awakened from an ancient tomb. "Who did this?" she shrieked, waving the paper crown like evidence from a crime scene. The teens down the street burst into laughter. One of them even said, "It's a good look for it." Karen turned a shade of purple I'd only ever seen on overripe plums. "Of course," she blamed me. "This is your doing," she yelled, stomping up to my porch. I looked at the crown dangling in her hand. "If you think I'm talented enough to inspire the entire neighborhood to mock you in unison, I'm flattered. You're encouraging them." "I'm barely doing anything," I replied. Actually, I'm enjoying the peace. Peace? How can anyone live like this? She screamed, pointing at the porta potty, as if it were a nuclear weapon. Pretty comfortably, actually. She stormed off again. Richard trailed behind, whispering something about maybe letting things calm down, which was ironic because the only way Karen ever calmed down was if someone tranquilized her like an angry zoo animal. And so, as the porta potty stood firm and the gravel refused to magically vanish, Karen moved to her next tactic. She began recruiting, which would have been concerning if anyone respected her enough to join her cause. But watching her attempt it was comedy gold. I'd hear her knocking on doors, spewing propaganda like a suburban dictator running for HOA president of a town of 3. She carried binders, flyers, handouts, none of which had been requested by a single soul. Her pitch went something like, "Our community is under threat. Standards are collapsing. Property values are plummeting. We need leadership. We need order. We need me." Whatever she said next was usually drowned out by a door closing. One guy literally shut the door in her face mid-sentence and yelled, "Lady, you've been here 4 months." Another neighbor chimed in, "We don't want an HOA." We moved here to avoid one. Karen returned home every time looking more defeated, only to re-emerge moments later with a new strategy, a new binder, and the same delusions of grandeur. By now, the stress was eroding her entire facade. She stopped wearing makeup. Her hair was always frizzy. She swapped her stylish blazers for oversized hoodies that said things like, "I don't need Google, my husband knows everything," which felt like a personal cry for help. Her lawn began to suffer. The spiral topiary lost shape. Weeds popped up. And for Karen, that was probably more humiliating than the porta potty. But her lowest moment, the moment the universe itself seemed to say, "You need to chill," was the day she confronted the UPS driver. I swear on everything sacred, this actually happened. The UPS guy parked normally, stepped out with a package, and Karen charged at him like a linebacker. "You can't park here," she screamed, pointing at the street. He looked around, confused. "On the street? This is HOA property." He blinked at her. "There is no HOA here, ma'am. This entire block is under HOA review." He stared at her for a full second before saying, "Lady, I deliver in 200 neighborhoods a week. Trust me, I know an HOA when I see one." Then he walked away, leaving her frozen like a statue hit by a freeze spell. That moment spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Karen got roasted by the UPS guy. The whole block repeated it for days. By then, Karen teetered at the edge of a meltdown cliff. And when people like Karen reach that tipping point, they only have one thing left: a lawsuit. And boy, did she file one. The stack of papers arrived in my mailbox in a thick envelope stamped "Urgent Legal Action." The return address? Her house. She represented herself. I laughed so hard reading the first page I choked on my sandwich. She listed me for property interference, emotional distress, HOA violations, still non-existent, visual pollution, aggressive landscaping, intent to provoke rebellion within the community. I swear to you, she used the phrase "intent to provoke rebellion." Like I was some kind of revolutionary general leading an uprising against her suburban dictatorship. But she wasn't done. She also demanded removal of all obstructions, a public apology, payment of $3,500 for emotional damages, a mandatory mediation session to restore community harmony. Harmony. She wrote that with a straight face. It was so absurd that I almost framed it. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I called a lawyer a real one, unlike the imaginary one Karen probably consulted in her dreams. He reviewed everything, laughed even harder than I did, and said, "She doesn't have a case. She's built things on your land. You can countersue." So I did. And that countersuit hit Karen's doorstep like a meteor crashing into dinosaur land. From the moment she opened the envelope, I knew the tide had turned. She screamed, loud enough that birds flew out of trees. Richard came running outside asking what happened. "She's countering!" she shrieked. "He's suing us!" "This is insane!" "No," Richard said quietly. "This is consequence." She froze. Richard rarely contradicted her, but even he had reached his breaking point. Neighbors peeked out of windows, dogs barked, someone even clapped. And that was the moment Karen realized everything was spiraling out of her control. Her illegal fence, Evidence. Her fake HOA notices. Evidence. Her asphalt invasion. Oh boy, evidence. The porta potty? Completely legal. She had armed me with ammunition without knowing it. But the courtroom wasn't ready for what she would try next. Because Karen had one more trick up her sleeve. A trick so ridiculous, so unhinged, so profoundly stupid that even I wasn't prepared. And I'd seen her fight a UPS driver in broad daylight. What happened next? That would be the moment Karen's imaginary empire burned to the ground. Courtrooms have a very specific atmosphere. If you've ever been inside one, you know exactly what I mean. The air is heavy. Everything echoes. People suddenly forget how to walk normally. And even when you know you're right, there's a jittery weight that sits in your chest, a mix of anticipation and the fear of somehow being blamed for a crime you didn't commit. That's how I felt walking into the county courthouse for my case against Karen. Except, I also felt a tiny, undeniable spark of satisfaction. Because for the first time since she'd arrived in the neighborhood, Karen wasn't stomping around with a clipboard or barking HOA orders at innocent passers-by. No, she was nervous, pale, clutching a manila folder to her chest like it contained the sacred laws of the universe. Richard walked beside her, carrying an overstuffed binder labeled HOA Files Confidential. It would have been intimidating if the binder wasn't covered in sparkly, gold-lettered stickers, like someone had purchased them from a craft aisle clearance bin. If I didn't know the context, I would have thought they were here for a 6th grade science fair. As soon as they saw me, Karen stiffened like a deer caught in headlights. Richard cleared his throat loudly, pretending not to be rattled. But the sight of their mismatched confidence, hers brittle, his crumbling, told me I'd already won half the battle. We all sat in the hallway before the hearing. My attorney, a calm woman named Lillian, who'd handled land disputes for 20 years, sat beside me, flipping through folders of actual evidence. She leaned in and whispered, "Be prepared. The judge in this county does not tolerate nonsense." "Oh," I murmured, glancing toward the Hendersons. "He's about to get a symphony of it." Just then, Karen approached us. Not with anger, not even with her usual superiority. No, she walked up with false politeness so thick it belonged in a syrup bottle. "Before we begin," she said tightly, "I'd like to offer an opportunity to resolve this without the need for public conflict." I blinked. "You mean without you embarrassing yourself in front of a judge?" She twitched. "We're willing to consider removing part of the fence if you agree to relocate that hideous blue structure and stop obstructing our no," I said before she could finish. Karen inhaled sharply through her nose, then turned and marched back to Richard. Lillian shook her head. "That woman has no idea what's coming." Finally, the bailiff called our case. Walking into the courtroom felt like stepping onto a stage. People always think courtrooms are private, but anyone can attend. And apparently word had spread in the neighborhood because at least 6 familiar faces were seated in the gallery. Mrs. Turner even brought popcorn. I'm convinced she thinks our block is her own personal soap opera. Karen didn't notice them. She was too busy straightening her blazer, adjusting her posture, and rehearsing whatever delusional speech she'd prepared. When the judge entered, a tall man with silver hair and a look of permanent exhaustion, everyone stood. "Case number 3874, Henderson versus Miller," the clerk read. "And Miller versus Henderson," the judge added dryly. "Quite a situation we have." Karen raised her hand, ready to speak like she was at a school assembly. The judge didn't even look up. "Ma'am, you will speak only when addressed." Her hand froze midair. She lowered it slowly, mortified. Richard opened their binder. A paper fell out. Then another. Then, about 20 more. Watching him scramble to gather them was like watching someone try to catch confetti in a windstorm. My attorney didn't even bother hiding her smirk. The judge gestured. "We'll begin with the plaintiff." "Mrs. Henderson?" Karen stood, smoothing her blazer. "Your Honor," she began with practiced composure, "my husband and I have been subjected to relentless harassment, property obstruction, emotional distress, and a severe violation of neighborhood standards." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Neighborhood standards?" "Yes, Your Honor. As representatives of the HOA, there is no HOA registered at that address," the judge cut in. Karen froze. "Well, we're in the process of forming one. That does not grant you any legal authority over your neighbors," the judge said bluntly. Karen blinked, thrown off balance for the first time. But community guidelines are essential," she insisted. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Henderson, do you understand that enforcing rules for an organization that does not exist is unlawful? She opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at Richard for help. He shrugged helplessly. Karen cleared her throat. Your Honor, we had reason to believe the driveway was shared. The judge nodded slowly. And what reason would that be? Richard jumped to his feet. Our measurement. The judge looked exhausted again. Your what? Our tape measure, Richard said proudly. The judge blinked. Twice. You're telling me, he said slowly, that you determine property boundaries using a household tape measure? Richard nodded enthusiastically. A contractor grade 1. Lillian stifled a laugh beside me. The judge's eyes drifted to me. Mr. Miller, do you have your deed and survey documentation? Right here, Lillian said, standing and presenting a neatly organized binder. The judge flipped through it, nodding as he read official county stamps, certified surveys, and aerial maps. Mrs. Henderson, he said after reviewing everything, every legal document shows the disputed area as belonging entirely to Mr. Miller. Karen's mouth dropped open. She looked like someone had unplugged her personality. That can't be correct, she whispered. It is, the judge replied. But the fence, the asphalt, our improvements were built on someone else's property, the judge said, his voice sterning, which is illegal. Karen made a strangled noise. We were simply making community improvements. There is no community authority granting you that power, the judge reminded her sharply. You acted unilaterally and unlawfully. Karen's eyes darted to the gallery. She realized her humiliation had an audience. Her cheeks flushed red. The judge looked at me. Mr. Miller, anything to add? I stood. Your Honor, all I wanted was for my property line to be respected. I asked them multiple times to remove their structures. Instead, they expanded further, issued fake HOA violations, and repeatedly used my driveway as if it were theirs. The judge nodded. Understood. Then came the twist I didn't expect. The judge turned to Karen. You mentioned having a survey performed. Do you have a licensed surveyor present today? Karen exchanged a panicked look with Richard. We didn't hire a licensed surveyor. But you submitted a sketch labeled as a survey? The judge asked. It was an estimate, she whispered. The judge sighed so deeply it echoed in the courtroom. Bring the contractor forward, he ordered. Karen stiffened. The contractor? Yes, ma'am, the judge said. The one who performed the paving. Karen hesitated. Richard avoided my eyes. The bailiff left and returned minutes later with the paving contractor, a large man with tired eyes who clearly had somewhere else he'd rather be. He stepped forward. The judge asked, Did the homeowners tell you they owned the land you paved? The contractor nodded. Yes. They said their neighbor abandoned it. And did you question the lack of permits? The judge asked. The contractor swallowed. Honestly, Your Honor, they paid in cash. I didn't ask. Karen let out a horrified gasp. You weren't supposed to say that, the contractor shrugged. I'm under oath. The judge pinched the bridge of his nose. Mrs. Henderson, this is blatant trespassing and unauthorized construction. Karen sputtered. But he said, but the boundaries, but the HOA. There is no HOA, the judge said firmly. And even if there were, it would not override county property records. Karen looked like a marionette whose strings had just been cut. All the fight drained out of her. Finally, the judge delivered his decision. In this case, he said solemnly, the court rules in favor of Mr. Miller. Karen made a strangled noise again. The Hendersons will remove their fencing, asphalt, lighting fixtures, and any other installed elements from Mr. Miller's property. Furthermore, they will be responsible for restoring the land to its original condition. Richard sat down hard, as if gravity suddenly doubled. Additionally, the judge continued, the Hendersons will pay Mr. Miller's legal fees. Karen let out a dramatic, wounded gasp, identical to the sound someone might make if stabbed by a decorative topiary. And finally, the judge added, cease and desist from issuing any communications or enforcement notices under the title of HOA. Any further attempts will result in fines. Karen covered her face in her hands. She wasn't crying. She was hiding from reality. When the judge dismissed the case, the gallery actually applauded. He glared at them, but even he couldn't hide a tiny smirk. As I walked out of the courtroom, I passed Karen in the hallway. She looked up at me, defeated, humiliated, silent. For the first time since she moved in, she had absolutely nothing to say. But I did. Next time, I said softly, measure twice before stealing. Her face twitched. I didn't stop walking. Walking out of the courthouse with a judgment in my favor should have felt like the end of the war, a triumphant victory march, trumpets blaring, neighbors cheering, confetti falling from the sky. And in a way, it did feel victorious, but more than that, it felt quiet, peaceful. The kind of peace you only appreciate after enduring months of insanity, manipulation, and battles you never wanted to fight. The moment I stepped outside, the sunlight hit my face, warm and clean, like the universe was finally exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Lillian, my attorney, handed me a copy of the judge's signed order, a crisp, beautiful piece of paper that essentially said, "This is your land. They messed up. They pay. A masterpiece, frame-worthy. Congratulations," Lillian said. "Not many people win property cases this cleanly." I nodded, feeling the tension finally slip from my shoulders. "Thanks for everything." "Just promise me one thing," she said, stuffing her papers back into her bag. "If they try anything else, don't handle it yourself. Call me first." I grinned. "I'll try." She gave me a look that said, "You won't, but okay," then headed to her car. I stood in the parking lot for a long moment, breathing in the fresh air, letting the weight of the ordeal finally roll off my back. I expected to feel anger, or resentment, or the lingering irritation that usually comes after surviving a long, exhausting conflict. Instead, what I felt most was gratitude. Not gratitude for the harassment, the fake HOA notices, the stolen driveway, or the emotional whiplash Karen had inflicted on the entire neighborhood, but gratitude that it was over, and gratitude that through all of it, the truth held up exactly the way it should. On the drive home, I wondered what kind of state the Hendersons would be in. Would they already be dismantling their fence? Would Karen be waiting with another bizarre declaration of HOA supremacy? Would Richard be outside sulking while clutching his binder of glittery official documents? But when I turned the corner onto our street, the scene I found was even better than I imagined. Karen was sitting on her porch steps with her face buried in her hands. Richard stood behind her with the defeated posture of a man who'd realized he had married a demolition team disguised as a woman. The fence section closest to the street was already partially taken down, boards leaning in awkward angles, cement chunks scattered across the grass. The paving crew, the same one Karen hired months earlier, was now back, reluctantly jackhammering through the asphalt they'd illegally installed. The workers were visibly irritated, probably regretting every moment of agreeing to do off-the-books work for an HOA wannabe with a clipboard. The sound of asphalt breaking apart echoed through the neighborhood like justice ringing from the heavens. One of the workers saw me and nodded. "You won," he called out. "I did," I said. He gestured toward Karen with a sympathetic shrug. "She's something. You have no idea." Karen looked up, then eyes red, hair disheveled, expression hollow. For once, she didn't have a single snarky comment or delusional explanation ready to launch. She just looked tired, small, human. It hit me then that I didn't actually hate her. I hated what she did, the way she acted. The way she bulldozed through boundaries, literal and metaphorical, with the reckless confidence of someone who believed consequences were optional. But seeing her like this, well, even villains look different when the mask falls. She stood slowly and walked toward me. Richard tried stopping her, but she brushed him aside, head held stiffly even though her spirit had clearly cracked. She stopped 3 feet away, as close as she could get without seeming like she was surrendering. "I hope you're satisfied," she said quietly, voice shaking. I studied her for a moment. The old me might have thrown a jab, a sarcastic remark, a victory lap. But I'd spent enough time in the trenches with her insanity to know that some battles don't need a final punch. "I didn't want any of this," I said. "I just wanted you to stay on your property." She swallowed, jaw clenched. "We thought we were in the right. You weren't." Her eyes flickered embarrassment, humiliation, and maybe the tiniest shred of understanding. "I didn't mean for it to get this out of hand," she murmured. I raised an eyebrow. "You built a fence on my land." She winced. "You paved part of my driveway." She nodded stiffly. "You created a fake HOA." She closed her eyes. "Okay, yes, that part was excessive." "Excessive?" I echoed. "You fined a UPS driver. He parked incorrectly," she blurted, then immediately regretted it, pinching the bridge of her nose. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. "Look," she said, stepping back. "We'll fix everything." The judge made that clear. "And the legal fees," I reminded. Her shoulders sagged. "And the legal fees." There was nothing left to say. She walked back toward her house, her steps slower than I'd ever seen. As the demolition continued over the next few days, the neighborhood buzzed with relief. People walked by more often just to watch the illegal fence come down. Kids rode their bikes in figure eights near the porta potty, still standing proudly on my property line. Retirees took lawn chairs out onto their porches, sipping lemonade like it was the best entertainment they'd had in years. And slowly, little by little, the Hendersons unraveled what they'd built. The lights came down first. Then the decorative stones. Then the wooden sign declaring Henderson Driveway Entrance, which was ripped off so forcefully the nails snapped in half. The asphalt removal took the longest peeling back layers of wrongful ownership, like erasing a crime scene. Finally, after nearly a week of noise, sweat, and bare minimum compliance, the last chunk of illegal construction disappeared. My driveway, the real one, the original one, stood uncovered and whole again. I walked out one morning as the crew packed up their tools. The lead worker approached me. "All done," he said. "Thanks," I replied. "You guys did good work." He hesitated before adding, "She tried to talk us into leaving part of the fence up." I nodded. "Sounds like her." He shook his head. We told her the judge's order said otherwise. She got real quiet after that. I watched their truck pull away, leaving behind an empty strip of gravel, battered, uneven, but rightfully mine. For a moment, I just stood there silent, still, letting the reality sink in. Months of stress, arguments, fake violations, and absolute lunacy, all undone, all corrected, all brought back into balance. I'd won. Not by yelling louder, not by matching her crazy, not by using force, but by standing my ground, documenting the truth, and letting the law do what the law does best when people like Karen push their luck. Later that afternoon, Karen appeared again, not to scream, not to threaten, not to enforce imaginary guidelines. She simply whispered, "We're listing the house." I blinked. "Really?" She nodded. "This neighborhood isn't what we expected." I almost laughed at the understatement of the century, but I didn't. I let her save what little face she had left. "Well," I said gently, "I hope you find the place you're looking for." She nodded again, turned around, and walked away. And that was the last real conversation we ever had. 2 months later, a moving truck arrived. The Hendersons loaded up their things, the fancy topiary, the solar lights, the binders labeled HOA documents, and drove off without a goodbye. The neighborhood breathed for the first time in a year. Kids played outside again. Dogs barked without fear of fines. UPS drivers parked wherever they pleased. And me? I finally got my driveway back. I even left the porta potty there a few extra weeks, just as a ceremonial reminder of the war we'd all survived. Standing there that final evening, watching the sun set over my reclaimed land, I realized something simple but powerful. Boundaries matter. Respect matters. And no matter how loud or entitled someone is, the truth will always outlast them. Sometimes life throws you into battles you never asked for. Sometimes the people who cause the biggest problems are the ones convinced they're fixing things. But if this whole ordeal taught me anything, it's this. You cannot let someone else define your space, your worth, or your rights. Stand firm. Know your ground literally and figuratively. You don't need to shout to win. You don't need to stoop to their level. The truth, the law, and your own patience will do the heavy lifting. And if you're dealing with your own Karen, remember, boundaries aren't rude. They're necessary. Let me know in the comments, have you ever dealt with a neighbor who thought they owned more than they did? And if you enjoyed this wild ride, don't forget to hit subscribe for more insane HOA stories.